The reality is that since the mid 1700s, something changed in humanity, and economic growth and prosperity continued on a steady growth path for the last almost 300 years now. Small businesses, half of the employment in the country, and that tends to be the volatility of employment, accumulation of 35 trillion, and the structural deficits that we seem to be stuck in the United States.
Today on the show, I'm happy to have Bob Dewey. He's the founder of the Exploring Prosperity podcast. Now, Bob, this is a newer podcast, yet you've already had some monster guests on here. So definitely want to get into it today on how you're pulling these guests. What are you doing that's unique here with the show? Thanks for coming on today.
Well, thank you, Chad. It's nice to be here. I am not really aware of the things that I'm doing unusually. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and one of the things that I think can be done is tying everything into a theme. And the theme for me is that there is really record levels of pessimism right now over the last few generations in the United States about the next generation being screwed. Polls are quite clear on that. And I started on March 17th, and ironically, on March the 15th, the Wall Street Journal ran an article saying how much despair there was among young people these days. And so I organized all of these things into categories of where is this despair coming from? And should we really be that pessimistic? The reality is that since the mid 1700s, something changed in humanity, and economic growth and prosperity continued on a steady growth path for the last almost 300 years now. And so the chances that we're right at this precipice, this moment where everything is suddenly going to be bad for the next generation, seems to be quite an extreme bet. So it's the exploration of this paradox of all this pessimism. It's easy to know that the headlines draw attention, the negative headlines, and that the unsung heroes, primarily small entrepreneurs, are really what powers the economy. And we hear about that a lot. Small businesses, half of the employment in the country, and that tends to be the volatility of employment. But anyway, so I try and pull in people and talk about a specific category. And if the reception is good, I reach out to people I don't know. And a lot of the time they're saying, I'd love to come on. And so that's fun.
Yeah, for everybody who doesn't know Bob's podcast yet, his 10th episode was with Anthony Pompliano. He had Lynn Alden on like episode 5. So he's just pulling in these monster names with a brand new podcast. So Bob, how are you doing your outreach to these individuals? It has to be something very custom here.
I specify what it is I want to talk to them about, and I do some homework on what I know that they're good at and focus on that. And I find that I believe that they appreciate the specific nature of the hour that we're going to spend together. And I think that's probably the big difference. I think that a big portion of this pessimism, I think, belongs squarely on the government. And the primary driver of that is the debt accumulation, 35 trillion, and the structural deficits that we seem to be stuck in the United States. I think that's a large portion of why people think we're never going to get out of this mess. And so about 40 or 50% of my speakers are addressing some component of that, of the debt or the economic management of the country, or how markets are going to react. And whether people are going to lose their money on this, and why do the stock markets keep going up when everybody's pessimism keeps going up in lockstep? So I believe that it's the specificity of what I'm going to ask them. I send them an agenda. Okay, I always ask what they would like to focus on in case there's something they've been working on that I don't know. And that doesn't often come back as I want to make sure that we talk about this. Because usually I know what they're working on, and I say, I want to make sure that we talk about this, and here's how it fits into what we want to discuss.
Is your background actually in economics, or is this just more something that came with time, a passion of yours?
Oh, I was in the stock market forever. I covered major hedge funds and institutions on the stock side. So our business was to advise them on what stocks to buy and sell based on what our company thought were the best stocks, industries to invest in, things like that. And so my job was very much a relationship job between ideas. And that was the really fun part of the job. And that's a little bit what I'm doing now too. It's how do you get people to open up to new ideas about how things work, and what is it that everybody else is doing that isn't appropriate? And that's what stocks are really all about. It's understanding the fundamentals, the economics, the backdrop, and what the companies are doing, and then finding out, trying to guess what the sentiment is and how many people own the stock or are already short the stock. And so that was my career. And that's where I built my knowledge base. So I'm not an economist, but I am an experienced person in the markets, particularly equities markets.
So what do you think about what's happening now with the equities markets?
I think that this is a natural outcrop of one of the longest bull markets that we've seen. It's been about 9 months without a 2% correction. This week was the first one. I think that there are going to be other corrections. I don't think that what is happening, based on the people I talk to, there isn't enough of a disruption yet. All that we saw really this week was Japan trying to create losses among the hedge funds who have been long this carry trade, where you borrow yen for very low rates, you buy other securities in other areas in other currencies with high rates, and you clip that coupon. And the Bank of Japan has a very difficult problem because they have a weakening economy through demographics primarily and a problem funding it. And so while they have been a country with surplus, a creditor nation, and the US is a debtor nation, this is one of the topics we covered with Lynn Alden in the last episode. They do have a very big problem over the long period of time. And so what's been happening is the yen has been weakening, and that trend should be intact. And all that's happening is the BOJ every once in a while has to tap the brakes to smash all of the cars behind them to keep this steady erosion in their currency value. And the chances are very good that the yen will continue to depreciate because they have to continue to print money, essentially. By their own, they already own a lot of their stock markets, they own a lot of their debt markets, and that is a situation they're stuck in that's going to continue for a while. And so I think the US equity market should be fine. That's not, this is just a sideshow of economic activity that all in is not going to be a killer in the near term. And then our structural deficits are stimulative. And so it's very difficult to see how, with that happening, that we get normal recessions. When we do, it's going to be a very big problem. And a lot of my guests talk about that, but it's very difficult to pick when that's going to happen.
Doesn't Japan also struggle with an aging population?
That's a key component of their economic problems over the long term.
So with the US equities market, we know we have some of these factors like this. Do you think we will have a stronger correction maybe in the next couple of years?
Maybe sooner too. Markets are not a very accurate reflection of economic activity in the near to midterm. And so I think that we've just been so smooth and so upward for a while. And a lot of that's because of the deficits, but also the money liquidity in the system. There's just a lot of excess liquidity, which is part of the reason that we should all be relatively optimistic about the near term and the medium term for our country, because the amount of new business activity creation and the amount of money available to fund that activity is still at historically human history record levels. And with technology delivering so much power to every individual to make a big difference and to get their ideas to the top of an organization or out into the public, so you can create nonprofits or you can create political movements or you can create companies of magnificent size and scale on a tiny base. And this, what Pomp talked about, and this is what a few others of my guests have talked about, which is the power delivered to the individuals has allowed this Einstein's problem to be fixed, which is the missing Einsteins. Jared Rubin, professor in California, was on my show recently, and he was talking about that's probably the biggest concept is in prosperity is not so much what we see in this country as the extraordinary wealth of the billionaire class and how everything looks so great here in riches. It's much more the decline in subsistence living and poverty that marks this new era of human prosperity that has happened over certainly the last century, but even 2.5 centuries. And so it's the power that can be delivered now, or the power at any individual's fingertips. And now we're talking 6 to 7 billion people in the world who have access to the internet and these tools, rather out of the 8 billion, rather than a century ago when that was in the 5% range. And so the potential for human capital to expand our wealth and living standards is better now than it's ever been before.
Bob, you have me very excited to see how your podcast continues to grow here.
I
And
really appreciate it. Thanks so much. I'm so glad we had a chance to connect this week.
if any of our listeners wanted to follow your podcast, listen to some episodes, where can they find you?
Yeah, one of the things that I do that is different from other podcasts and YouTube channels that I've seen is I write up the connectivity of it. I'm trying to connect these ideas to the problems that people feel these days. And so I write a Substack. If you go to Exploring Prosperity with host Bob Dewey, the name of my podcast on Google, that pops up for YouTube. I also have Apple and Spotify that turn it into podcasts. And then I write up in Substack each of the interviews. And then I also write about ideas that will lead to future guests. Healthcare is going to be a big area. Education is a big area. I had a wonderful guest, Sam Chauncey, on, who's been with Yale University for 7 decades. The timing was coincidental because it happened to be the day that the morning after Columbia University decided to send in the police and arrest everybody who was protesting against Israel on campus in the spring. And he talked at great length about, interestingly, he was one of his first jobs at Yale after he graduated in 1957. In 1964 or so, he became the assistant to Kingman Brewster, the president. And so the two of them really set policies for all of the protests that unfolded for civil rights and against the Vietnam War. And then there were Black Panther trials in New Haven that they had to prepare for. And he spoke all about how they approached the problem. And one of the big differentiators then to now in the university system is that back then, I think he said there were 12 people that ran the university. And today, the administrative class of Yale is measured in, as I remember, over 1,000 people. And so it's just an entirely different animal to be managing all this. Back then, it was a university that people paid for. Today, the federal government represents a very large portion of the revenues of each major university. And that carries with it a lot of baggage, a lot of requirements that didn't exist before. And so he talks eloquently about the mess that the university system is in now and how much he worries about it. And then he also talked about, because he's been advising students the whole 70 years plus, how the human capital hasn't changed very much. The attitudes have changed. The self-perception of being able to change the world has changed. But it was fabulous to get somebody like him on. I'm hopeful that I'll have some other people in the education space. I'm very also interested in the healthcare area. And so I'm looking forward to seeing who else I can get on my program.
The self-perception of trying to change the world, is it now achievable or not achievable from that episode?
Very
achievable.
Yeah. He said that the new generation definitely has, there's a great book called The Coddling of the American Mind. And there's definitely a different role that parents have played in college students' lives today that shows up. There is an appeal to authority that kids have these days that they didn't have in the past. And so rather than taking things into their own control, they often seek an authority to impose the control on the situation. But in general, the human ingenuity and the capability of the humans of the students that get into Yale from now all over the world, rather than simply smaller geographic areas in the old days, certainly gives him hope that these students are going to go on to be leaders the way they have in the past.
Everybody, Bob puts a lot of time and thought into his podcast. It's a newer show, but I already know this thing's going to really hit. So
Appreciate it. I hope so.
Yeah. Everyone make sure to check out Bob's podcast, Exploring Prosperity. Everybody, thank you for listening to another episode of Failing to Success. I'm your host, Chad Kalecki. If you like the show, make sure to subscribe, and we'll see you next time.